Hey, good afternoon. Today we're going to start looking at this part of unsupervised learning, which is clustering. So basically trying to group together similar objects, entities, examples, and keep apart those that are different. I'm going to start with a brief introduction to clustering, the basic idea, and then we're going to look at a simple clustering algorithm with several different applications to illustrate clustering and also to show you some applications, and also to have a first look at this expectation maximization approach. So this is not quite a specific algorithm, it's more a generic statistical and machine learning approach that we're going to see at different times applied to different problems in clustering and other unsupervised learning problems. And we're going to use k-means as a simple introduction to the general idea of expectation maximization. So let's start with clustering. So what we want to do with clustering is to try to group similar examples together and to distinguish those that are different. So if you look at that cloud of points, even though we don't have labels, we don't have any classification for any of the points, we can see that they are grouped in three different groups. So one purpose of clustering would be to identify these groups and to set them apart. We have three clusters of points there. There are some issues about what we do with these points that are outside, whether we assign them to a group or leave them out, how we identify those groups and so on. And those are the kinds of questions we're going to start looking into. But this is the basic idea. We want to group similar examples together. So for this, we want to either minimize the difference or maximize the similarity between the clusters. Note that the difference is a generic term, or a dissimilarity is a generic term that can be a distance measure or something like that. Also, similarity is also a deliberately vague term, but the idea is that we want within clusters to have examples that are more alike one another, and then between different clusters we want to do the opposite. We want to maximize the difference or maximize the distance or minimize the similarity. So we want examples that are in different clusters to be less like each other, so more different from one another, and those that are within the same cluster to be more like each other. So one basic notion here is that since this idea of difference or similarity is central to the purpose of clustering, we need some measure of similarity or difference or distance, something like that, something that we can measure that can tell us whether 2 points are less like one another or more like one another. And the purpose of doing clustering, well, there are many different possible applications, but we can see one major application of clustering is to help understand structure in the data. So even for ourselves, psychologically, cognitively, grouping things that are alike together is a major part of how we conceive the world around us, how we understand things. So we're trying to do that with clustering. And also we can use that to make sense of data that is very complex or very large data sets. So if we have a group of things that are alike, it doesn't matter if the group is very large. Once we put everything in the same group, it's easier to understand, and now we can deal with a smaller number of groups. For example, if we are dealing with gene sequences in all organisms, we have huge databases of DNA sequences, but if we can organize them in genes, in groups of genes that play some role in the organism and so on, that makes it easier to understand. The same thing for searches in the internet and things like that. And also we can use clustering to determine if there are meaningful groups. So basically we want to understand or to test if there is some structure to the data. So even if we don't have an idea of what we're going to use the groups for, the simple fact that there are groups in our data samples can indicate some correlation, some structure in the data. Another application that is also useful is to reduce the amount of data that we need. So usually when we want to use data for something, we need some representative sample of the data, but maybe we have too much data and we only need a subset of the data. If we can group similar things together, then it's easier to get a representative sample of the shape of our data set. So this is one famous example of clustering. This is Darwin's first sketch of the tree of life. So it was just a remote hypothesis at this time, so he even wrote "I think," and then he sketched how some species could descend from ancestral species. And we can see this as an example of hierarchical clustering. We have one large group, then it has subgroups, and each subgroup has subgroups, and so on. And we can represent this way a structure on our data set. This is another more recent example for identifying ghost cities in China. So what the authors of this paper did was to apply clustering to data on location of people in those cities when people use some services like search and so on, or Baidu and things like that in China. Location data was stored, and then by clustering they could find where people spend time at different times of the day, where they were located, and then by projecting those clusters on the map they could find that there were many neighborhoods where nobody ever went into. So those were blocks of buildings and so on that were completely vacant, and so they could identify regions in several cities which had lots of construction but nobody inhabiting those buildings. So this is the sort of thing you can do with clustering, trying to understand the structure of the data and figuring out some knowledge that is hidden inside all that information. Another possible application is to summarize data or reduce the amount of data that you're going to use. You can use this for compression, but you can also use this for sampling your data. For example, if you use prototypes that represent neighborhoods in the space where your data lies, you can use those as representatives of groups of similar examples, and then reduce your data set only to those examples. This can improve performance in some cases where you don't really need many examples, but you need the right set of examples to solve some problems like classification or regression, something like that. For example, we can start with this data set we saw a while ago, all these points, but now using a clustering algorithm that finds representatives of local groups, we can reduce this shape here to this set of representatives that still represents the layout of the points but uses a smaller number of examples. And we can fine-tune the number of examples that we want by changing the number of clusters that we want to create from those examples. So the problem here of trying to use clustering to understand or summarize the data, one problem that we meet in the beginning is how we define those clusters. What are clusters in the data? How many of them are? Which of them do we want to consider? So if we consider this distribution of points, we can think that there are two clusters here. We have a green cloud here and a red cloud here, and they are far apart. But we can also think of three clusters because these points seem not to be the same thing as those. So we could separate them, or we could put this into four clusters because there are some intermediate points here, or even 5 clusters. And there is no clear objective reason to prefer one number of clusters to another. You see there is a continuous here on those metrics of similarity within cluster and distance outside the cluster that we could try to optimize, but even those metrics they depend a lot of exactly how we measure them, how we define similarity, how we define difference, or if we use Euclidean distance or something like that. So one major problem in clustering is to figure out what exactly do we want to cluster, how do we want to cluster our data points, and what will determine how many clusters there are and which examples belong to each cluster. And to do that, I'm going to give just a quick overview of some theoretical concepts that we may want to think about when choosing clustering algorithms and their parameters. So, two different approaches to clustering are partitional and hierarchical clustering. Partitional clustering will consider all the examples as if they were at the same level and basically create a partition of different clusters. This is similar to what we did with classification. We were also partitioning the space of our where our data lies. So what we're doing is basically cutting different parts for different clusters. Hierarchical clustering is different in that we are going to create larger clusters that include subclusters. So it's not a question of one point belonging to one cluster or another, but the point belongs to several different clusters, the large ones, and then subclusters and subclusters and so on forth. So here you can see an example on the tree of life where a species here belongs to this group, and this group also belongs to this larger group, which belongs to this larger group of all the species, and so on. So this is a significant difference, whether we're going to try to cluster everything on the same level, or if we're going to create clusters of clusters and subclusters and so forth. In this case, we have an example of partitional clustering. We divided our data set into 5 groups. And here I represented hierarchical clustering by using first a top-level cluster with the colors. So we have a large red cluster and a large green cluster. And then with different symbols, we see subclusters. So here in the green cluster, we see 2 subclusters, one with the triangles pointing upwards and the others downwards. And here we see 3 subclusters with the squares, the hexagons, and the circles. So this would be hierarchical clustering because we have clusters defined at different levels and they are nested. Another question that we need to answer is whether, regardless of whether clustering is hierarchical or partitional, we can think of membership of examples as not being necessarily exclusive. So, for example, in partitional clustering, it will be easier to imagine. We can consider exclusive clustering, where each example belongs only to one cluster, but we could consider also examples overlapping in different clusters. So in hierarchical clustering, we have some overlap at the different levels, but then we also need to decide whether we want some overlap at the same level. So whether this hexagon, for example, could belong a bit to the circle or not, or if they must be really distinguished. So clusters may overlap, examples may belong to more than one cluster, and the way in which they belong to more than one cluster can also vary. For example, with fuzzy clustering, we have a membership function for each element that has a continuous value between 0 and 1. So basically this is how much each example belongs to one group, to one cluster. So we can continuously fine-tune membership of elements to clusters. With probabilistic clustering, we also have values varying from 0 to 1, but they are probabilities, so the membership of each element to all the clusters, when we sum it, must add up to 1. So this is an additional constraint, and we can interpret that value as the probability of the example being found in one cluster or having originated from each of those clusters. So this is basically reasoning about how each example belongs to one cluster. And then we need also to decide whether we want all the examples to belong to clusters, or if we want some examples not to be clustered at all. So this would be partial clustering as opposed to complete clustering. So this is not so much, the purpose here is not that you memorize all these terms, that is not the important idea, but it's to point out that Even though the basic notion is quite simple, we want to group things together. The details then become a lot complicated, because exactly how we group things together, if we create groups within groups, if each element belongs to more than one group, and how, and so on, raises lots of questions that we need to decide. And we're going to see examples of different algorithms that handle these questions differently. Then there are other considerations about the data itself. Note that this notion of well-separated clusters is not something that we choose, but something that makes it easier to see the clusters there. So basically, if we have data where the examples are closely grouped together, the similar examples, and they are dissimilar from those that are on other clusters, then we have well-separated clusters. This is dependent on the data, but it's also dependent on the features, on how you transform the data, and so on. So we can also see this as something we could aim towards in order to simplify clustering. So if we can reprocess the data, or do something to the data to facilitate having well-separated clusters, then clustering becomes easy. It's also something that we can try to measure. We're going to see in the next lecture some measures about this, in order to evaluate how good the clustering is. So the ideal would be for our clustering algorithm to produce groups of examples that are very compact, very similar to one another within the cluster, and different from those of different clusters. Now, ways of determining the cluster. One way we're going to start by looking at this one is to use prototypes. So basically, we have some element which may be an element of our data set, or it may be a synthetic example created by the algorithm, but there is some example there that represents the cluster, and we assign different points to each cluster depending on a comparison between those points and the prototype. So, for example, in this case, it would be the closest prototype in Euclidean distance. That's why we get these lines separating the clusters. So all the points that are closer to that cross there will belong to this cluster. If it's closer to this cross, it will belong to this cluster. And the dividing line is perpendicular to the line joining the two prototypes. We can also define clusters in many other ways. For example, based on contiguity of similarity and so on. So this would be a different way of clustering that would be more appropriate for different shapes of clustering. We can do density-based clustering. For example, in this particular algorithm, we're going to see it later on today. We can even consider that some points are noise. They do not belong to any cluster. And then there are groups of points where the density is higher, and those form the clusters. So basically, what we need to ask, yes? That depends on what you want to do. So the thing here is not, there is no unique recipe that you should use this clustering algorithm and do this and so on, because the purpose here is to try to understand the data and find the structure in the data. So it depends on exactly what you're looking for and the kind of data what you use. Okay. So we have many different questions here. How do we compare the examples? We need those that are more alike to be in the same cluster, and those that are more different to be in different clusters. But we need to convert that into something that we can measure in order to cluster the points. So exactly what functions we're going to use to do that, we need to decide. We need to decide how to determine or how to assign each example to clusters, if they must belong only to one cluster, if they are they have some partial assignments to different classes and membership of different clusters and so forth. Then the kind of algorithm that we're going to use, it also depends on the kind of data and what we want to understand about clusters. For example, if we have clusters like this, prototype-based clustering or density clustering can work well. If we have something like this, prototype-based clustering will not work well because of the shape of the clusters. If we have something like this with lots of dispersal and so forth, then density-based clustering may not work very well, and prototype-based clustering may work better. So it depends on what structure of the data you have, and whether it matches or not with different assumptions about what clusters are. So basically, remember this goal. We want to understand what's in the data, and in the next lectures we're going to see several examples of clustering algorithms and try to see how to apply them, and in which cases we should apply them. But then the exercise is also trying to use clustering to understand the data, but depending on the data, different clustering algorithms may be more appropriate. So usually you need to do some experimentation if you're starting to look into some data sets. So let's see the first clustering algorithm, k-means. The idea is to find the best way of cluster points, or the best clustering. So clustering is a term that, if you use it as a verb, it's the process of computing the clusters. If you use it as a noun, will be the set of clusters that is created. So we want to find the best set of clusters, of k clusters. K is a predefined value, and we consider that best is basically those that the groups that minimize the distance within the group, or the distance to one representative of the group. So this clustering algorithm is partitional. It's not hierarchical. We are using it to create a partition of our data. It's exclusive, so each example only belongs to one cluster and completely belongs to that cluster. It's complete. There is no noise. Everything belongs to a cluster, and it's prototype-based. We're going to compute midpoints of each cluster, and so this is the k-means. We have k cluster, and each one is defined by the mean of all the points belonging to that cluster, and this will be what determines how we're going to cluster the points together. So that's the idea of k-means. Now we have different algorithms to compute the position of the clusters. We're going to look at this Lloyd's algorithm, which is basically you start with a random set of k centroids, so these mean points of the different clusters. You are going to assign each example to each cluster by looking at the closest centroid. So each example will belong to the group of the closest prototype, the closest centroid of the clusters. And then we're going to recompute the centroids, the central points, the midpoint of all the clusters, move the centroids there, and keep iterating this until convergence, until there is no change. So first we need to start with a random sample. Let's consider that we have these examples. One way of initializing this algorithm, this 4G method, is to start with coordinates of a random set of examples. So note that it's not a very good idea to start with random coordinates, because we don't know what space our data is occupying. Remember that you can have data in many dimensions, but the points do not necessarily occupy all possible combinations of values. So with this 4G method, what we're doing is we are selecting actual examples, a subset of the examples at random. That way we are picking points along this hypersurface where our data lies. Okay? Then we are going to assign each example to the closest centroid. So the closest prototype that we chose. In this case we had one here, so all these are closest to the square. They become blue squares. Then here we have the purple triangles, the red circles, and so forth. There are two, a triangle and a octagon. They're very close together, so there are two clusters there. And now we have these groups of examples assigned to each cluster. We can compute the mean points of each group of examples. So we can start our algorithm. I forgot just to mention this one. This is another way of beginning of assigning the first set of centroids. Yeah? No, here there are 5. There is a triangle there. They are very close together. But this is a fixed parameter that we determine. So k means we start with k clusters and we choose the k. So in this case, I set k equals to 5 and I have 5 clusters. One way of starting is to choose at random and then we assign the clusters there. A different way of starting is to assign each example we have at random to any one of the k clusters. And then we compute the midpoint of all those examples assigned. So that would be the centroid. So this would be the random partition method. Basically, 4G method gives you a random sample of points, so it's more spread out along the points. The random partition tends to start your centroids closer to the middle of your point cloud because you are averaging over subsamples, random subsamples of points. Yes, that's a problem, but with k-means you need to pick a number first. So k-means has a fixed number of clusters that you decide. So now we start the algorithm to compute the best position for the point. So if we use Lloyd's algorithm, we start with a random set of centroids, in this case using 4G initialization. And now we can compute the midpoint of each of these clusters. So these are the blue squares. The mean point of the blue squares is here. We move the centroids there. So we move all the centroids, and now we recompute the clusters. So for example, these triangles belong to that purple triangle cluster, but since this one moved over there, now these are closer to the circle. And once we update the membership of all the examples, now the mean point changes, so we have to recompute the mean point and shift the centroid there, and we keep doing this until we converge, or until we have 2 iterations where the membership of the examples did not change. So if the membership does not change, the mean point does not change, and everything is now finished. Okay? So we do this until everything converges, and what happens is that our initial random centroids shifted position until they found this equilibrium place where they are close to sets of examples that ideally are close to the centroid. Of course, we don't know at first what is the best number of clusters, but we're going to see that maybe that's not a bad thing because clustering can be used for many different purposes. Okay? So this is the idea of k-means clustering. The first set of centroids. There are many different ways of initializing, but you can, if you use 4G initialization, you choose at random a subset of your examples. If yes, one of your examples at random. If you use random partition, you assign each of your examples at random to one of the 5 clusters, or one of the k clusters, so 5 in this case, and then you compute the midpoint of that group. So each example, in this case, was assigned at random to a different group, and then we have the centroid of those groups. So basically, this is, I can just write this in code. This would be initialization. So 4G, we shuffle all the indexes of our examples and pick the first k. So we are picking at random without replacement, so without repetition on the examples we pick. For random partition, we create a random vector of assignments. So if we have k clusters, these are random values between 0 and k minus 1. So we have k different values here at random. And then we compute as the centroids, as the mean points, the prototype for the cluster, as the mean of all the points that were randomly assigned to that cluster. So this would be for random partition. Now for the algorithm itself, first we need to assign our examples, so label our examples with the cluster of the nearest centroids. We get the differences in coordinates between all the centroids, all the prototypes or the clusters, and our data points. We compute all these distances, and then we get the closest one. So each example will be assigned to the closest centroid. And now we compute the position, the new position of the centroid by taking the mean point of all the coordinates of the points that are assigned to that cluster. So for each centroid, we see all the points that are labeled with that particular cluster, and we take the mean of all their coordinates. Okay? So this is, if we alternate this, we label to the closest one, then we recompute the mean, and we keep doing this until it converges. So the general idea here is to find these best prototypes for the cluster, the best position, and we can do this, for example, with the distance measure. So remember, we need some way of determining whether the examples are more alike or less alike. In k-means, we generally use Euclidean distance, but we can go more general than that. We can use, for example, any Minkowski distance, where you can change the power, the p there. So Euclidean distance will be using a power of 2, will be norm 2, where you square the difference between the coordinates and then you compute the square root. But you can use, for example, power of 1, which is Manhattan distance, or any other thing if it's appropriate. And conceptually, this is similar to a self-organizing map, but without the topology of the self-organizing map. So remember that with the self-organizing map, we had each neuron has coordinates in the space of our data, and we were pooling the neurons to the nearest example and presenting examples at random. So we get more or less the same effect of spreading the coordinates of the neurons along our data set. The difference is that with the self-organizing map, we also have the topology of the network, so each time one neuron moves, the neighbors in the network will also move in the same direction, and we stretch that layer to cover all these examples. And in k-means, we don't have that. We simply move the centroids to the right place. There is a variant of k-means, which is k-medoids, which solves one problem that we can have with k-means, which is we need to find the coordinates of the prototype, of the centroid. So not only do we need a distance measure, but we also need some topological space where we can find a midpoint or a mean coordinate, a mean example between several examples. There are situations where we can have some notion of distance or difference, but we cannot easily compute a mean point. For example, suppose that we are dealing with protein sequences or text, and you measure differences by measuring how many words are different or how many letters are different between two strings. You can use that to cluster because you have distances, but you cannot use k-means because there is no notion of what is a mid-string between two different strings. You cannot compute the average string of a set of strings. It doesn't make much sense. But k-medoids solves that by assuming that all these centroids, all these prototypes are no longer just the mean points, but they are examples inside the data set. And so what you do is you assign each example to a cluster that has the most similar medoids to the example. And then you try changing the medoids to see if you can replace one with any other example in the cluster that will reduce the total distance between the midpoint, the prototype, and all the elements in the cluster. So we are doing something similar to k-means, but instead of inventing, of creating a new point that represents the center of the cluster, we look at the points in the cluster, in our actual example, and just measure the distances to select the best one. And we do this iteratively until it converges. So the advantage of k-medoids is that you only need some measure of difference or dissimilarity, but you do not need to be able to create new examples that are at the center of some group. Okay? But other than that, it's simple. It's similar to k-means. Okay, so now I'm going to use this. This is a very simple algorithm, k-means. We are iteratively relabeling examples into different clusters and then recomputing the centroid of the cluster, and we keep doing that. And this gives us a simplified way of understanding this EM algorithm. So let's look a bit more formally at our problem. We have a set of observable data. We'll call it X. These are the features that we have measured and characterize our data set. But then we have a set of labels, which are the membership of each example to each cluster that is not observed. These Zs are hidden variables in our model. So they are somewhere in our model, but we cannot measure them, we cannot observe them. So this is where there is a big contrast between classification and clustering. We can think of them as being fundamentally the same thing, but with a very important difference. In classification, we observe the labels. So when we are going to train our model, we have the X, which is the features that we input, and we call the Y the observed labels, the target values that we wanted. So we could do this maximized likelihood. So the likelihood is the probability of having that kind of data. So those X's with those labels, given that we placed our parameters or we chose some values for our parameters. And then we train our classifier by changing the parameters to maximize this probability, and this is the maximum likelihood solution. The problem here with clustering is that these additional variables, the Z, are not observed. We don't know what they are. They are also part of what we're doing in cluster. They are hidden variables in our model. So we cannot compute these directly. We cannot compute the probability of X, joint probability of X and Z given the parameters, because Z is also part of what the model is trying to figure out, and we have no observations for that. But other than that, the problems are simpler. So if you can conceive of clustering as a sort of classification problem where the classes are unknown and the model has to create them and to assign examples to different classes. So let's suppose that this is the complete data. This would be if we could look into whatever we're trying to do, so see that aspect of reality that actually determines the clusters, and this would be what we would need for a classification problem. We have the X would be the two features for the coordinates of the points. The Y would be the membership to these three classes, and we would solve this with a classification problem. However, with clustering, we don't have that hidden variable, the assignments to each of the groups, so we can only see the coordinates of the points, and that Z variable is part of our model, is a hidden variable in our model. So we have to deal with this incomplete data. If we had everything, if we had this, we could try to measure the error, minimize the error, maximize the likelihood, and so on, what we saw so far, but we only have this information. So, since we cannot compute the likelihood of our parameters given those X and Z, because we cannot observe Z, we cannot do this maximum likelihood directly. But we can estimate one from the other. So basically, we could try to estimate what would be the expected Z if we assume some parameters. So this is the basic idea of the expectation maximization algorithm. Let's make up this new function, which includes this Q function includes our parameters, the ones we're trying to compute, and some previous set of parameters. We can start them at random or something like that. And what we're going to do is, this function is basically the likelihood function for these new parameters that we're trying to compute, based on the distribution of X, which we can observe, and Z, which we cannot observe, but assuming Z to be distributed as expected if the parameters, the correct parameters, were the previous version of the parameter. So we make up some vector of parameters, figure out what is the expected value of all these assignments, and now we're going to optimize the parameters by maximizing likelihood, assuming that those are the z values and the x values we observe. So this is the expectation step. We create this based on this approximation of some likelihood function, assuming that we have the z values. And the z values are those expected values given the previous set of parameters. And now we maximize the likelihood in order to obtain a new set of parameters. So this set is hopefully a bit better, and now we keep doing this until we converge. So we use the new set of parameters as if they were the old set of parameters. We recompute the expected values for the z, or the expected distribution for the z, and then we optimize again. So this is the expectation maximization approach. We can see a bit of this in k-means. Of course, this is formally, these are random variables. They have distributions of probabilities. In k-means, we are not dealing with distribution of probabilities, but we can see the same basic idea here. So let's suppose that this is our objective function, or the distortion measure, as it's sometimes called in clustering, which is we are going to sum for all the clusters the quadratic distance between each point and the centroid of the cluster, but only for the points that belong to the cluster. So this R function here is just a 0 or 1, and it's 1 if point n belongs to cluster K, or 0 otherwise. So this is just to select those points that belong to the cluster. Now, note that this x here is what we observe. These are the features. This R is a hidden variable in our model, because which point belongs to each cluster is something we cannot observe a priori. We need to figure out as we are trying to optimize our parameters. So what are we going to do? We can first, if we have a set of centroids, so these mu values here are the k centroids. If we have a set of centroids, we can minimize this expression with respect to R, to the membership, by simply choosing to have R 0 for every case, except for the closest centroid to each point. So if we choose the centroid that is closer to each point, we minimize this function with respect to R. And now, so what are we doing this? In fact, this is similar to the expectation stage, where we are creating a function here to optimize by setting the hidden variables, the assignment of each point to each cluster, in the way that would be expected if the centroids are in those positions. So now that we know which point belongs to each cluster, we can minimize this with respect to the position of the centroid. So we have the derivative of this. The derivative must be 0, and we can solve this by just computing the midpoint, the mean of each cluster. So this would be the maximization step, or the equivalent of the maximization step in k-means. So basically, what we're doing here is we are alternating between minimizing in one direction, in one set of variables and another. And first, we compute, basically minimize this by computing the expected assignments of points to different clusters, and then we minimize the position of the centroids, and then we go back and redo the first part and alternate until it converges. So this is not quite expectation maximization, because k-means is not about distributions of probabilities, but it's the same general idea. We want to solve a problem of labeling each example into one category, one cluster, but these clusters are not observed, like we did in classification, where we could observe the classes on the training set. These clusters are latent variables in our model, so we need to optimize with respect to those variables and then with respect to the other parameters and alternate things. So we're going to see this a bit better, more formally, next week with Gaussian mixture models, because only when we have probabilistic models do we have fully the expectation maximization algorithm. But this is just to give you a preview in a simpler context. So let's see an example of what we can use k-means for. So one obvious problem with k-means is that we have to choose the k value first. So if we don't know how many clusters there are, then it's a bit hard to figure out what to put in the value of k. But this is not necessarily a disadvantage, because it may be precisely what we want. And in fact, k-means appeared first as an algorithm for vector quantization, which is when you have a data set of examples with continuous features, but we want to reduce that to a representative sample of a fixed number of examples. We're going to see how to do that with a color image. Okay? So this is a demo based on a scikit-learn demo, and I'm using this image from Wikipedia. And the reason for using this image is that the blue channel is always 0. So this, in spite of having 3 color channels, red, green, and blue, because all these images have the 3 channels, this image actually does not use blue, so we can see only in 2 dimensions in the red and green. So we can do this. We can take all the pixels in the image and plot each pixel on the green axis and the red axis, and we see each pixel as a combination of red and green. So this is our data set. We have all these different colors, different combinations of red and green. So if we consider that we also have a blue channel, there it's also 0, but we can consider that we have all these values in red, green, and blue. But now we want only a specific set of colors, and we want to simplify the image into a specific set of colors. So this is just to, you'll use this in the tutorial, so you can look up the code, but this is just to load the image. You can use scikit image for that. You can use imread to load the PNG. So these PNG, JPEG, and so on are compressed files, and they are not very easy to read directly, but with those functions, you can import them into a NumPy array. So you have all the values of the pixels, and then you can manipulate that. So the shape will be, this is a 3-dimensional array, because you have the width of the image, the height, and then the depth, which is 3 in a color image, because you have the red, green, and blue channels. They are in 8 bits each channel, so they go from 0 to 255, but if we want between 0 and 1, we can divide by 255. So this 0.0 is a leftover from Python 2, but in Python 3 you don't need to put the 0.0 there, you can just put 255. So basically, these are our colors. We're going to reshape this, the original matrix divided by 255. We're going to reshape this into a matrix with 3 columns and as many rows as the number of pixels in the image. So the number of pixels is the width of the image multiplied by the height of the image. And this we can plot in this way. So to do this plot, you can use from matplotlib the scatter function, because this allows you to give this color argument where you can put a list of colors with the same size as the number of points you're plotting. And so this will plot each point with the respective color. So we just use the colors from the pixels, and we can not only draw the positions, but also the colors. So the positions are the first 2 columns, the red and green components, and then we paint each dot with the color of the pixel. So now let's do k-means. We can put this data. This is a data set with 2 columns and n entries equal to the number of pixels. We use k-means like this. We import the k-means object. We create it with 64 clusters. So we fit with this 2-column data set, which is this one here. So this is just the first two columns of all the image. We are ignoring the blue channel. And then we predict the labels for all the points. So the labels are the indices of the clusters the points belong to. And we can get here from cluster centers the actual coordinates of the centroids. So this would be in units of red and green for each centroid. And this is just to do this plot. So basically, I'm going to draw an X in black, and then I draw an X in white, and I have this axis here, which is a white cross over a black background. And so these are the centroids that we computed. They are spread out, as you can see, depending on the density of the pixels, so the amount of pixels in each color combination. We don't have centroids here or here because we don't have data there, and we have them representing the distribution of points. So now we can assign each color. In this case, I don't think you can see very well, but all the pixels belonging to each centroid are colored with the color of that centroid. So where do I have the code for that? Here. So for each pixel, I'm going to give it the red and green components is equal to the centroid for that pixel. So instead of having this different spread of colors, I'm going to convert the colors of each cluster all into the same color, which is given by the centroid. And now we can convert the image there. So this is the original image. This is in 24 bits if we consider the 3 channels, or 16 bits if we ignore the blue channel, because each red, green, and blue has 8 bits. But we converted this into only 64 colors. So this table of centroids is only 64 colors, so we have 6 bits per pixel in that second image, and we cannot see a very big difference between the two of them. But we can do it, we can compress more. So in this case, I did the same thing with 8 centroids. You can see this is the original range of colors on the pixels. But if I assign all the pixels in that belong to each cluster, if I give it the color of the centroid, then I have these 8 different colors here. And now I can apply the same thing to the image. We can see now that the colors are a bit degraded, but it's still, we can see the shape of the original image. So in this case, we reduced from 24 bits to 3 bits by this type of clustering. So you see that k-means, it's a disadvantage that we have to adjust k for the number of clusters, but that depends on the application. For example, for this type of applications, it's good that we can specify the number of clusters and force them to be what we want. So this is basically what you're going to do in the tutorial too. And to sum up this part, we saw this idea of grouping data by similarity. We need some measure of distance, similarity, and so forth. And we saw different types of clustering. So not yet the algorithms, but different ideas: hierarchical, partitional, exclusive, overlapping, and so on. So we're going to see examples of these in the next this week and next week. And for now, we saw k-means as an example of clustering, and also to give an idea of expectation maximization. So there are some chapters there if you want to read more about k-means.